Hello. We come to class 9 in our series, and finally to the books of Chronicles, or properly, of course, the book of Chronicles, divided into two because of its length, but a single work. The Greek translation of Chronicles, which is in the Septuagint, the ancient Jewish Greek translation most commonly used by Jews, is entitled Paralepomena, which means the things left over, which shows clearly that the person who was translating it, or the people who were translating it, or the person who was putting on the title, thought that it was an addition to the previously constructed history of Israel that was put together with the multiple books that we've been looking at, and of course Genesis and Exodus before them. That's certainly possible. When I began laying out this class, I had it all set so that we would do Chronicles in the 7th and 8th slot, and then do Ezra and Nehemiah in the 9th and 10th, because Ezra and Nehemiah are the return from the exile and everything, and so I thought, it would nicely set them up for turning to, well, really, I guess you would turn to the Apocrypha, then the Deuterocanon, or whatever you want to call it, the books that fall between these Old Testament books and the New Testament books. But of course, if you look at the very end of 2nd Chronicles, chapter 36, beginning at verse 22, which in the ESV Study Bible is on page 798, if you can't find your way around this place. Now in the first year of Cyrus king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing, quote, "Thus says Cyrus king of Persia, quote, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up." Close quote, close quote, end of the book. The book ends with the announcement of Cyrus to the Jews in his empire that they should get themselves back to Judea. Judea is the word for where the Jews live, right? Like the Swedes live in Sweden, and the Irish in Ireland, and the Scots in Scotland. So the Jews live in Judea, just FYI. And so, looking at that, and realizing that Chronicles doesn't, it does, and in that sense, Chronicles does lead up to, I'm sorry about the lighting today, I struggled with it. This is my second sweater that I'm wearing, trying to find one that made the lighting better. They seem to affect it, and anyway, this is why, professionals have makeup people and lighting people and stuff. I don't have any of that stuff. I'm just here, doing the best I can. Realizing then that you could make the argument that Ezra and Nehemiah come last. That was certainly what I had in mind when I first laid out the class. But then when I went through everything before we began, I remade the syllabus to put Ezra and Nehemiah 7 and 8 and have Chronicles be 9 and 10. And the reason I did that was because I wanted to, rather than put all of the historical stuff before Ezra and Nehemiah into a pot and say, this is the history before Ezra and Nehemiah, now here's Ezra and Nehemiah, I wanted to have us read through all of the history up through Ezra and Nehemiah and then step aside and do Chronicles. The idea being that in that way we would think of Chronicles more along the line of the way the ancient Jewish translators did. This is an alternate collection of material, though of course there are a lot of overlaps, right? This is an alternate collection of material, and to be understood as the translators understood it in the ancient period, we need to go through the other stuff and then say, okay, we're up through Nehemiah, we know where we are, the wall is built around the temple is built, the sacrifices have begun, okay, we're ready to start being Israel again after the exile. And now here's another version of the story that will get us there. That, I think, gives you a better appreciation for what the people handing down the scriptures in the tradition thought they were giving us when they gave us Chronicles. Now, it's worth stopping and reminding ourselves again, it is true that you can read the 8 books we read up to this point and then think that Chronicles are the extra stuff, the stuff that had been left out. Now we're going to put in some of it anyway. But it is also true that one can imagine Chronicles being written not so much to supply missing information, which is what the things left out would make me think of, missing information, right? But rather to offer the reader a different perspective on the same material rather than new material. I think that this makes more sense of what's actually going on in Chronicles when I look at it, to think of it as a different presentation of the material based on different priorities, rather than just here's some of the stuff you left out, right? So we're going to give you extra stories about these people. And in order to see how that works, we need to look at all of Chronicles and see the way it works. So just to lay my cards on the table then, I hope that at the end of the next lecture, I will have made clear to you at least what I think right now is the perspective from which Chronicles is written, and the point of view that the book is designed to put forward, because that's what I'm going to try to do in the next hour and 51 minutes. So let's begin. You have notes that I sent out, which will do us for the next 2 weeks. I wanted to give you again 2 outlines. This first one from J. Vernon McGee. We've seen him before. I liked J. Vernon McGee. He puts his own comments in the, his breakdown of things is in the regular type, and then his comments are in the italics. Like all good Christian Bible interpreters, he's interpreting the whole Bible all the time. So, he begins his outline of Chronicles, and he gives you something from the Gospel of John. That's of course that's perfectly traditional and perfectly legitimate. It's not the way that everybody chooses to do it. What he's essentially doing here is saying that the first 9 chapters of Chronicles are all about how the children of Israel are the sons of God, how the children of Israel are God's people. And if you look at 1 Chronicles 3:5 together with Luke 3:31, you will see that Nathan in those verses, Nathan is the son, now I just looked at this and I'm going to forget, Nathan is the son of David, from whom Jesus takes his lineage. So that Jesus is in the body a descendant of David, along with lots of other, these people have lots of wives and lots of children, and so it's not, my mother's mother was always convinced that we were descended from Alfred the Great. Not just her and I, but everybody in our family, right? I mean, she was telling it to me when I was listening, but she said it to everyone else too. If that's, I don't know how you would know that, but if that were true, that would, at this point, Alfred the Great, living in the middle 800s, I think, he would have several million descendants if he had any at all, just because everything multiplies over generations. So saying you're descended from Alfred the Great is not all that much more of an accomplishment than being descended from Adam and Eve. As my children, maybe the only theological lesson my children ever learned is that the Bible says we're all related, which is an important theological point and a very good one to be going on with in terms of all sorts of things, ethics among them. But genealogy is important, and where you come from is important. Jesus being a descendant of David doesn't mean that he's, Prince Jesus. There are too many people in between, and for that to mean very much in terms of politics. It wouldn't mean anything in terms of politics, but it's a theologically important thing to know in a lot of different ways. So it's one of the things that little exercise does, if you do that with a Bible study group, is immediately they begin to have a different sense of what the genealogies in the Gospels are there for. All of a sudden the genealogies seem significant instead of just something you get past in order to get to, the Good Samaritan. Okay. One of the things you see if you look at the way Vernon McGee is dividing this is that in a way that parallels the genealogies, as we will see later today, the material on David here about David's reign, chapters 11 through 21, is really moving through the saga of David's life in an organized way, trying to give you a relatively full overview of how he's functioning as king, because they're trying to set him. The picture of David is David as the king, and then Solomon comes in as the king too, and then you get a history of the kings of Judah after that, and the later part of Chronicles. Just to note how much you can learn from an outline. Notice he says building the temple is his most important accomplishment. Certainly in Chronicles, I think that's correct. Chronicles is very temple-centric. Solomon is the temple king in history, but also in Chronicles is thinking of him that way. And then notice that he lists in after the division of the kingdom, he said, here are the reformations that are given particular prominence in Chronicles. Notice that the chapters listed are not all the chapters there are. This is a selective way of looking at this stuff. Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joash, Hezekiah, Josiah. These are repeated reformations of the worship of the Lord and of the status of Israel as a covenant people. As a capital P Protestant, McGee would love this because, of course, he's all about Reformation as a son of the Reformation. So he would like to see Old Testament Reformation to look forward to his New Testament Reformation, which would be the birth and life and death and resurrection of Christ. And then, of course, the Protestant Reformation in the 14 to 1500s in Europe and on since then. Since we're children of the Reformation too, that's interesting. It's an interesting way to look at things. You should be reminded when you do your Anglican history reading how much the English Christians, especially with the young devout King Edward VI, were very eager to make parallels between the Reformation under Josiah and the Reformation under Edward, that this is another instance of God's people renewing their understanding and living out of the covenant. So a big step forward for God's work in England, the same way that Josiah was a big step forward for God's work in Israel, right? So that's a very interesting outline, I think. Then you get the New Jerome Biblical Commentary with one of these outlines as table of contents, which is, again, you can cut and paste and hand that around if you do Chronicles with people. Chronicles is actually an interesting study with a Bible study group. Let's look just quickly through the notes beginning on page 3 before I won't go through the table of contents stuff. Satterthwaite and McConville are absolutely right to say, which is what I am just about to say to you now. You will notice that we're gonna look at the genealogies right after this when we start looking at the book, but I don't think it's giving it away to tell you that if you look at these genealogies in Chronicles, that the book of Chronicles does not go back and parallel. You need to understand what the book of Chronicles is another view of, right? The book of Chronicles does not go back to Joshua, where we began, and go along with a different take on things up to the exile. The book of Chronicles goes back to creation and gives a different take on things up to the return from exile. It is, as far as that goes, a different take on the entire history of mankind up to the return of the children of Israel from exile. It's a much more Judeo-centric, Jewish-centric take on history than the Bible itself, the larger Bible itself has. And we'll see that in a minute. But that's an interesting thing to note. Also look, let me see where this is. Oh, here. If you look on the last page of the notes, the genealogies actually go past Zerubbabel, who is an exile period figure, which means the book can't be written, at least in its final form, before 450 BC, which is pretty late. It also means that really the book is covering not just up to the return, but after the return of Israel. And so the fact that it ends with the announcement of the return, but does not treat the return itself, is a very interesting choice. It treats a number of things that other parts of the Bible treat, assuming that it's written later than they are. So it's not impossible that the authors of the book or author of the book could have chosen to overlap and done some Ezra and Nehemiah stuff, but he or she or they don't choose to. And that's an interesting thing to note, because that's a choice instead of, I'm doing this, because here I am in Washington, right? I'm doing this a week before Election Day. So I can't include in my lecture a sermon on how now that the election's over and so is elected, we need to, do X, Y, and Z as Christians. I can't do that because I don't know what's going to happen yet, right? If I'm giving the lecture, next week and I don't do that, and I'm not going to do that because I think I don't think American elections are big enough to get onto a discussion of salvation history. But if I choose not to next week, then that's because I'm making a choice that American elections aren't important enough to figure in consideration of salvation history, rather than just because I don't know, so I don't know what to say. Right? It's a different choice. So it does matter to realize that the book includes information that pushes it past the return, the writing of the book past the return, because then you know that you're dealing with an authorial choice. One of the first things I'm going to point out to you when we start going through the book is, as Satterthwaite and McConville say here on pages 270 and 271, the genealogies go all the way back to creation, but there's no mention of the Exodus, and the Sinai covenant is not in this retelling. It picks up with the actual telling of the story much later in the story than the broader Bible does. And it picks up so late in the story that the children of Israel are an organized people functioning not just as a group of related individuals. That's a modern way of talking. Not just, a tribal organization, but a kingdom. It begins with them at the kingdom stage with Saul. And that's a tremendously important fact. Exactly what to make of it is going to be something we need to think about as we go through. Now, there these notes, Satterthwaite and McConville, the real reason why I wanted to include these is not just for some of these notes to think about, but if you look at the one on 275, compare 1 Kings 1 and 2 with 1 Chronicles 22, those two verses, for their ways they treat Solomon taking over after David, right? Look in 278, see here's Asa. I think I've said before that my best friend in grade school was named Asa. I don't know how many American kids can say that these days, but I never thought of Asa as a weird name at all, or like some weird Bible name, because I can't remember not knowing someone named Asa. So anyway, among other things, it's very easy for kids to learn to spell. So if you're looking for a name for your child, Asa is a good name for a boy, because even a boy can spell Asa. You see there, you get 2 Chronicles, 3 chapters, and 1 chapter from 2 Kings, and you get Uzziah, 1 chapter in 2 Chronicles, 1 chapter in 2 Kings. We can look at those comparisons next time, along with the comparison of the Solomon succeeding David. Jehoshaphat might be interesting. I would like to maybe look at Hezekiah and Josiah here in the second part of the 278. Those are useful things to do next week that can maybe help us get a sense of the way these this telling of the story differs from the Samuel and King's telling of the stories. I'm reminded again of the fact that on your list is a book, I think it's called Old Testament Parallels, and it's Samuel, I don't think there's any Joshua stuff. I think it's Samuel, Kings, laid next to Chronicles, in a kind of synopsis, like a gospel synopsis thing. A very interesting book to have. If we were sitting around a table, it would be a great thing if we could each have a copy, and it can show you a lot of this stuff that Satterthwaite and McConville will sort of direct us to. We don't have the time for that kind of study, which is too bad. But it's actually a very useful book in a lot of ways. So, as just a general introduction, I'd like to stop there. And then let's go and look at the genealogy here at the beginning of 1 Chronicles. Hard to say really the beginning of 1 Chronicles, because you get 9 chapters, really. I think it's 9. You got a lot of chapters of genealogy. before they're really done. Yeah, because they give you another in 8, maybe it's only 8 chapters of genealogy. So all Israel was recorded in genealogy. Oh, but then you get the priests and Levites and Saul again. So you really get up, really through the first 9 chapters, it's pretty much genealogical material. A big mass of it. There are, people do everything. There are genealogy specialists in biblical studies who love this kind of stuff and huddle in little corners and stuff at Society of Biblical Literature conferences, their long beards hanging down. And every once in a while I sort of see them, in the restaurants, eating leeks and stuff like that. And they can make much more of this than I can for you. But I would like to point out some things. The first thing to notice is it does begin with Adam, and so it is at least in a rudimentary form, it's kind of a universal genealogy. It does go back to the beginning. Verse 28 in chapter 1 picks up with Abraham's descendants and goes through them, spreading, of course, beyond just the Jewish line. These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom, in verse 43, there in chapter 1. Then you get already the sons of Jacob, sons of Israel, at the beginning of 2, and you get the 12, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Dan, Joseph, Benjamin, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, right? And so then you're getting the tribes at this point going along. There's, as the New Jerome Biblical Commentary emphasizes, kind of interestingly, you see there under big B on the first page of notes, there's big B, and then there's little a, and then there's small Roman numerals 2 and 3 and then 5. You get these, the figure of Caleb keeps coming back. Caleb, who is clearly an important warrior in the Exodus story, who, interestingly enough, though he keeps appearing and does important things, he doesn't, in the imagination of the Exodus story in the main books. I've now read this a number of times through, sort of thinking about Caleb in the back of my mind. Caleb seems to do more than he sort of imaginatively gets credit for. The Jewish historical memories, not thinking of Caleb all the time. It's interesting that there seems to be more Caleb stuff in Chronicles here in this genealogy than one would expect if all you had ever done is read the, particularly Exodus and then the end of Moses' life and the beginning of the Joshua stuff. It may well be, I have read things where modern scholars imagined that there was more Caleb stuff than we now have. Ginsburg's multi-volume work called The Legends of the Jews, which is a collection of Jewish traditional material about Moses and drawn from the Talmud and the Mishnah. Mostly Talmud and Mishnah, but some, if you want to know everything Jews told each other about Moses, that kind of thing, you look in Ginsburg Legends of the Jews, and it collects together the non-biblical material, so you can look up Moses and read all about Moses. And I don't have a copy of Ginsburg. It's a massive thing, and it costs too much. And I don't think the seminary has a copy either. Maybe Father Starr does. But you could look in there. One could look in there to see how much extra Caleb stuff there is, and we might be surprised. Um, it's one of the things I thought about when I was looking at this. Now you get descendants of David here, beginning in chapter 3, David's own line. So this is going to be the royal line. By looking at the general outline, say the one above by McGee, we can see how Judah-centric as opposed to Israel-centric, southern kingdom as opposed to northern kingdom-centric Chronicles is. And so that will, of course, be one of the things that we can take away from noticing how much the emphasis on David is in the genealogy, because of course the Davidic line is going to be in the foreground through the whole book of Chronicles. Okay, so all of these different things about the many descendants of David. Just a quick note here in the 4th chapter of Chronicles, in the middle of the descendants of Judah, you get on verse beginning with verse 9, Jabez was more honorable than his brothers, and his mother called his name Jabez, saying, quote, because I bore him in pain. Close quote. Jabez called upon the God of Israel, saying, oh, that you would bless me and enlarge my border, and that your hand might be with me, and that you would keep me from harm, so that it might not bring me pain. And God granted what he asked. Those two verses, 9 and 10, were turned into a huge Christian bestseller. How many years ago was that? 10 years ago or so in the U.S., 15 years ago, called The Prayer of Jabez, which I did not bother to read, but I read some reviews of. It seems like one of the astounding misuses of Scripture in recent times in America, using these verses to put forward some kind of a prosperity gospel rooted in the Old Testament, which we don't want to put forward. There's a little note here about Jabez. The Prayer of Jabez book, I can't remember who wrote it. The Prayer of Jabez book was written before this translation was done, so they were aware of it, and they put in a little note about Jabez, which is just kind of linguistic, and makes some connections with other parts of the book, both 1st and 2nd Chronicles, maybe trying to damp people's enthusiasm. Just because we did have a woman in our parish here in Washington who brought in a copy of the Prayer of Jabez and tried to get me to engage with it. And so it's something you should be warned about. The fact that those little verses are buried in the middle of this genealogy shows to us how extremely de-emphasized they are by the book. Anyone who gets too worked up about those 2 verses is probably making a mistake, because they're certainly not put into any position of prominence by the writer of the book. Reading those things as if they were telling you some tremendous message is not treating them the way the book in which they appear treats them. This is not, here am I, send me, from the 6th chapter of Isaiah, a highlight point in the book. This is a part which is not being emphasized. Okay. Reuben, Gad, Manasseh, Levi, going on here through 5 and 6. We're going through the 12. Lots of sons of Levi. Here, that's a thing to notice. This is the kind of thing that genealogy people really go to town on. If you look at here, chapter 6, the sons of Levi, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. And then these are names you hear around Psalms and Proverbs because they're involved in the genealogies of people who serve in the temple. Then beginning in verse 31 of chapter 6, these are the men whom David put in charge of the service of song in the house of the Lord. And Then in 49, Aaron and his sons make offering on the altar of burnt offerings. Verse 54, these are their dwelling places according to their settlements. And verse 61, to the rest of the Kohathites are put out by lot these cities. Some of the clans of Kohath, 66, had cities of their territory. To the Gershomites were given out the clan of the half-tribe of Manasseh. On and on. This organization of the practicalities and the linking back in particular ways of the servants in the temple back to the 12 tribes of Israel is making a very strong argument for the validity of these people in temple service, for the organization that they were known to have. This goes along the strong emphasis in the genealogy on not just the house of David and not just the politically important people, but the people who are going to be important because of their Levitical roots and their connections to the temple, shows again how temple-centric the books of Chronicles are. And that's an important thing to be reminded of. So we get all the way through the 12. Benjamin, we're now in chapter 7. We get Benjamin in verse 6, and then Naphtali in 13, Manasseh in 14. Naphtali only gets one verse. Ephraim in 20, Asher in 30. And then you get to Saul, which sounds as if it's almost going to be a story, but it really turns into a genealogy. Saul, of course, being a Benjaminite, and so you get chapter 8 of this sort of Benjaminite genealogy, and chapter 9. Here we get to see something important. Okay, so all Israel was recorded in genealogies, and these are written in the book of the kings of Israel. And Judah was taken into exile in Babylon because of their breach of faith. So, theological interpretation of the exile, right, which fits perfectly well with the Deuteronomistic history that we read up till now, So just a quick note. How Deuteronomistic is that point of view, since other parts of the Bible seem to have it? Well, the Deuteronomistic history that we spent a whole class on certainly thinks that, but so does Chronicles here. So is that really a characteristic of the Deuteronomistic history? Can you say it's a characteristic of German people to have two legs? German people do have two legs, but since everybody else has two legs too, it's not a characteristic in the sense of something which is characteristic of them and not of other people. So saying that the exile comes about because of a lack of faithful living out of the covenant, doesn't really separate you out among biblical material. We could go on and on about that kind of stuff, but I just wanted to point that out. But anyway, notice that before we get done, we're not really done yet with the genealogies, but we're already talking about exile. In other words, it should be clear to us that these genealogies are written in the light of the exile, and so therefore in the light of the return. This must be, or this is certainly always taken to be, one of the central explanations of why there is so much emphasis on people related to temple service. The concern of the authors of the books of Chronicles, setting apart the Holy Ghost, right, seems to be very much on the taking up again of covenant life after the period of the exile, and so wanting very much to have their ducks in a row as far as who's going to perform what service, and do you know that they are legitimately descended from the people they need to be descended from so they can do that service and you'll be doing things correctly. All of that getting organized. Because the temple service does not get going again in the books of Chronicles, you might not be thinking that that's what they're leading up to. But there's good reason, if we look at the content of what the books have, how much they have about the temple and temple service and proper covenant stuff, that does seem to be where they're going, though they get only as close to it as Cyrus announcing it's time for everyone to go home. They don't get to where Ezra gets with actual service, with actual sacrifices in the temple. Okay? But that seems to be where they're going. It's very interesting how they do it differently. So all Israel's recorded in genealogies here at the beginning of 9, and they talk about the exile. Let's look here, just a little note. Now the first, this is verse 2 in chapter 9. Now the first to dwell again in their possessions in the cities were Israel, the priests, the Levites, and the temple servants. Some of the people of Judah, Benjamin, Ephraim, and Manasseh lived in Jerusalem. And then you get a list of some of the people. So, and of the priests, verse 10, you get a list of priests. And of the Levites, verse 14. And then the gatekeepers, lower servants of the temple, in verse 17. Some of them who had charge of the utensils of service, verse 28. The singers, verse 33, right? The different types of people who are necessary for proper temple service are around in Jerusalem where they need to be. It's very interesting that it's done this way. As we saw with Ezra and Nehemiah, where Nehemiah, where it ends with sending away the foreign wives and children so we can get back to people who are members of Israel, born as members of Israel, being parts of the covenant people. They are trying to get back to legitimate, historical, covenant life in Israel. And the way you do that is by checking on everybody's background, right? Now we saw that in Ezra and Nehemiah, particularly Nehemiah. So that's what we're being given here in 9. These are vetted temple-related people. Okay. Then you get a little genealogy of Saul here, verse 35 and following at the end of chapter 9. And then it's very interesting. If we look at McGee's outline, he's got chapter 10 as Saul's reign, right? So we're going to have 3 reigns. We're going to have bad king reign, good king reign, temple king reign, right? But of course, bad king reign, the reign of Saul, as far as the book is concerned, is the scene where he gets killed in battle. It's not actually a description of the reign of Saul. If you look at the outline and you had not read the book before, you might think you're going to get more Saul material than you actually get. You just get Saul getting killed. It's very interesting that Saul enters in order. Saul, if you're doing a middle school play, and you hand these things out, give the part of Saul, of course, to your tallest boy, because he's got to be head and shoulders above everybody. And it doesn't matter if he doesn't remember a lot of lines, because he just walks on and dies, by falling on his own sword, which any middle school kid would be happy to do. And then he gets to lie there while everyone else runs away and stuff. Saul appears only to disappear to make room for David. And what is done with Saul? What does the author do with Saul after he has arrived on stage? Look, verse 8 in chapter 10. This is Saul has died, and everybody ran away. The next day, when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. And they stripped him, and took his head and his armor, and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to their idols and to their people. And they put his armor in the temple of their gods, and fastened his head in the temple of Dagon, the fish god, right? But when all Jabesh Gilead heard all that the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and took away the body of Saul and the bodies of his son, and brought them to Jabesh. And they buried their bones under the oak in Jabesh, and fasted 7 days. That's what happened. So here's the comment, right? Verse 13. So Saul died for his breach of faith. He broke faith with the Lord in that he did not keep the command of the Lord, and also consulted a medium seeking guidance. That's the witch of Endor, right? He did not seek guidance from the Lord. Therefore the Lord put him to death and turned the kingdom over to David the son of Jesse. I know because Father Dart asked me in my oral exams for the priesthood what were the 3 things that Saul does that he's not supposed to do, and I couldn't remember them, it being, of course, my comprehensive exams, so I froze up. And I noticed that you don't get given all of them by Chronicles. It mentions that he broke faith with the Lord, that he did not keep the commandment, and also consulted a medium seeking guidance. He didn't seek guidance from the Lord. It's interesting. The only one of the 3 classic things that Saul is remembered as doing that were wrong, the only one you're specifically given is the consulting a medium rather than consulting the Lord. The most specifically and obviously religiously wrong, going through a kind of rite that seems like a religious rite, but not a rite involving getting close to the Lord, rather a rite involving getting close to another spirit, and the witch of Endor calls up, Samuel, right? That's what you get from Saul. So Saul appears in the book to be killed, which makes way for David. And Saul is mentioned as having been killed because he did the wrong things religiously, and we're specifically told of the wrong things that he did, we're specifically told the one which is the most obviously religiously wrong. So we're getting a very particular picture of Saul. It's not inaccurate, right? But it's very particular, and it's focused on making a contrast between him and David, having us understand that David is brought in by the Lord to replace this guy who had not done what he was supposed to do. And so when the real story begins, and we begin to get, real stuff going on, then we get David doing good stuff as opposed to Saul, who we are only reported him. The only things we specifically get reported that he does is kill himself and consult the witch of Endor. And you notice, of course, because that's where we've got to in the story, the long and complicated stuff about David when he's young, Goliath, being a shepherd's son, fighting off the bear and the lion, being a bandit chief and getting along with the pagans, all that kind of stuff is not there. He begins as king. So David in Chronicles is clearly a king, and only a king. He's really only in Chronicles as a king. He's not in Chronicles as someone who attains to kingship. As soon as the first time I believe that he is what you could call on stage is at the very beginning of chapter 11. Then all Israel gathered together to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh." In times past, even when Saul was king, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. You were the army commander, right? Saul has killed his thousands and David has killed his 10,000s. Oh, but that's the other story, right? And the Lord your God said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel. You shall be prince over my people Israel. David makes a covenant with them and they anoint him king according to the word of the Lord by Samuel. So David appears in the book as the king. The first scene he's in is the crowning scene, the coronation scene, which is very interesting when you think of all of the David stuff there is in Samuel before that. Okay, so they go to Jerusalem, and what is this? What are we shown of David as a king? Now that we've noticed that king is all we're being shown of David, so then what are we being shown here in Chronicles of David as a king? Well, he takes Jerusalem, which is of course going to be, which he does. He takes it from the Jebusites, right? Which, and this, by the way, um, as far as archaeology can tell, this is historically accurate. Jerusalem seems, again, it's very difficult to do archaeology in Jerusalem, but that area seems not to have been an originally Israelite area. It was a Jebusitic area. And Jerusalem is conquered by David and used by him as his capital. So he takes the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David, that's verse 5 in chapter 11. And so up goes Joab and becomes the chief. And he built, verse 8. He built the city all around from the Millo in complete circuit, and Joab repaired the rest of the city. Just as a note, there are a number of mentions of Millo in the Bible, in the Hebrew. It just says the Millo. And until quite recently, nobody really knew what the Millo was. There have been discovered, in the last 25 years, I believe, stones with Millo written on them around Jerusalem that were clearly part of what we would call the artificial structures built around the quite narrow ridges on which Jerusalem is built to widen them out and make broader places for people to build on. In other words, the Millo is what we would call the substructure put in place first to allow for a larger settlement to be built on top of what's now essentially an artificial, relatively flat platform allowing for building. The Temple Mount, for example, in Jerusalem, if you look at those aerial photographs, you look at those things and you say, oh, the city wall's right there. A lot of that's actually not city wall. That's part of the artificial structure that seems to go back, some of it, to Herod. That Herod put in on a grand scale when he was rebuilding the Temple Mount to have his even bigger temple there. Every time you want to build something in that part of the world, you have to build up a structure on which to build your structure that you're trying to use, and that seems to be what the Millo is. So the Millo is the I'm blanking right now. We had a godson of mine here who's an architect, and we were talking architecture for 3 days, and I knew all these things, and now I've forgotten all the words for them. But anyway, just as a note, I wanted to mention that because you see Millo here in the translation, and I wanted to point out, first of all, that our knowledge of the practicalities of ancient Israel does increase, though sometimes, of course, we wish it would increase more quickly. And also that knowledge can help us understand the biblical text that we're reading more and more clearly over time. We really are advancing in our knowledge of ancient Israel and biblical times, and that's a wonderful thing. Okay, so we get the taking of Jerusalem. Then here in verse 10 in chapter 11, we get another one of these accounts of the mighty men, the 3 and the 30 and all this, these stories that we also get in Samuel. This is clearly the way that these tales were told in ancient Israel. Um, you can hear people talk about them as sagas to make a um, comparison between them and the way Vikings talked about great warriors, and them and the way the Greeks talked about great warriors like Achilles and Agamemnon, and the fact that there are these famous stories. Um, the three mighty men breaking into the camp of the Philistines here, verse 18 in chapter 11, and they get the water for David, and he won't drink it, he pours it out, something that Alexander the Great does in Egypt when his army is marching there. A very good reverent commander thing to do, taking your soldiers' lives seriously. But these are the kind of stories that do stick with people, and so you get these lists now of mighty men instead of lists of genealogies. Okay, on and on go the mighty men. Um, Beginning of chapter 12, these are the men who came to David at Ziklag, when he could not move about freely because of Saul the son of Kish. We noted specifically that this period in David's life was not recounted. However, it is perfectly clear from the text that knowledge of this period of David's life is expected for the person who is reading this book or having it read to him. So you can see why it makes sense to think of this work as an adjunct work meant to go along with the things which we already have. If you read Chronicles in Hebrew, I am no great Hebrew scholar, though I did 6 years of Hebrew when I was in school. If you read Chronicles, it is perfectly clear that the Hebrew in Chronicles is a later stage in development than, according to the way that Semitic languages develop, is in a later stage of development than, say, Genesis or Exodus or even Samuel and Joshua. We talked before about the fact that those books have famously bad texts, but anybody can see that this comes from a later period, from the way the language works and the word forms and things like that, and some of the vocabulary. In the same way that you don't have to be a great scholar of English to be able to tell that The Great Gatsby comes after Romeo and Juliet, right? Even a foreign person learning English, pretty quickly, not immediately, but pretty quickly you could tell that. And so linguistically, if not otherwise, it makes the most sense to think, I think, that these books are quite late and are written to go along with other books that come from an earlier period. And they do show these signs in terms of content, like here at the beginning of 12, that makes us think this way. Okay, so you're getting more mighty men here in chapter 12. Okay. Here comes the ark in chapter 13. Uzzah, you get Uzzah putting out his hand to catch the ark, and Uzzah gets struck down. I've always felt bad for Uzzah because he seems to be doing the right thing, but Uzzah clearly is not allowed to touch the Ark of the Covenant, so it kills him even though he's trying to treat it with respect. It clearly sort of horrifies David too. Verse 11 in chapter 13, David was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah, so he called that place Perez Uzzah, and the breaking out or piercing or something of Uzzah to this day, dividing of Uzzah. Anyway, and so that then you get wives and children, defeat of the Philistines in chapter 14, and in 15 the ark comes to Jerusalem. Of course, this is an important part of the setting up of the temple And so this will be the last thing that we look at today. It will mean that just noticing in 15 the ark comes to Jerusalem, and you get all these Levites and gatekeepers and everything, all these people playing harps, they're all mentioned by name, and they bring in the ark, and they're doing sacrifices, and they put the ark in a tent, and with offerings there. David sings a psalm, which is quite like other psalmic materials that we have, which just shows, if you read the whole book of Psalms, or sometime when we do the book of Psalms, you'll see there's repetition among the Psalms, even in the book of Psalms that we have. So the use of different pieces of material more than once is not at all unusual. It's the kind of thing you would expect. And they worship before the ark. Okay, so we will begin next time with chapter 17 of First Chronicles, which is where David's all set to build the temple, and then it turns out that he's not going to do that. We will pick up next week. That's a good place to pick up because, of course, in the imagination of the book itself, the development of the cult of the Lord in Jerusalem is one of the central things going on. So we'll keep on going with this. I hope you can see, though, so far already developing, that we're getting a much more monarch-centered, but that's also because much more temple-centered and Jerusalem-centered telling of the tale, and that it picks up really just where it can begin to tell the story of Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is conquered by David. So there's no point in fussing too much about the children of Israel before David, because you don't get Jerusalem till David comes in, and they're all about Jerusalem and the temple. So thank you very much.